Okay, hello again. So for next week, you have to write an abstract. That's going to be the first section of the paper. So let's talk about that. Okay, so every paper, psych paper, is going to have a bunch of major sections. You have the abstract, the introduction, the methods, results, discussion, references. So the abstract, like I said, we're going to write one of those sections each week based on a different topic. And of course, this week is the abstract. So the abstract, well, let me just give you an overview of all those sections in case you're not aware of those. So the abstract is going to be basically a short summary of your paper. Just for people who kind of are not sure if they want to read it or not, they can kind of check the abstract and decide, yeah, this is relevant to me, I'm going to read it, or no, I don't care about this. Okay. The introduction is going to be kind of a review of past literature, of past research pertaining to your topic, kind of what you know, what you don't know that you're seeking to investigate, and then your research question. Your methods is going to be a detailed description of how you went about investigating that question, and then your results is what you found, obviously, all the statistical analysis, and then the discussions where you talk about the implications, any limitations, possible issues, whatever it might be. But mostly what the study then tells us, and also future directions. That's all in the discussion. So the abstract, like I said, is going to be just a really short, but a paragraph summary of your paper. And it's kind of mainly there to just let people know what the paper is before they dig into it, right? So imagine when you're looking for papers, if you're doing a literature review, you probably check the abstracts first to decide, is this relevant or not? So it's, like I said, kind of an elevator pitch, right? If you had, say you were, a researcher and you met someone in an elevator that was, someone you wanted to work, or someone that was curious about your work, and you kind of had to tell them in a very short, limited amount of space or time, what did you research? That's kind of what an abstract is. Short summary of the paper. So the reason I kind of go over those other sections, even though we're not doing those yet, is that the abstract could almost be like, well, it is really almost like a sentence or two summarizing each of those sections. So you could kind of think of it as, the first couple sentences on what we know, and then what we don't know that you wanted to that you investigated. Maybe a sentence or two on how you went about investigating that question, what you found, and what the results were. And then what the implications were. Okay. So what we're going to do is that's, rather than, that's kind of a lot of what you need to know, but it gets a little bit trickier than that because it's important to think about how to best use your space, how to effectively summarize things when writing an abstract. So just a few tips though before we get into some examples. First thing is it shouldn't be indented like a normal paragraph. It should just be not indented. Do not include stats. I'm really not a fan of that. It's like, again, if you were kind of to go back to this idea of an elevator pitch where you have 30 seconds or so to highlight your study, would you go into the specifics of, well, the p-value is this and the degrees of freedom were this? No, right? You would just say in English, we found X, we found Y, right? So that's why you typically don't include stats in your abstract, right? Just keep in mind that all these things will be talked about in detail, the prior research, the methods, the results in their respective sections, right? So that's where you don't need to and you shouldn't really be giving too much unnecessary detail, right? Especially when there's better things you could focus on. Same goes for references. It's not a rule, but I'm not a big fan of reporting references unless it's really important, like maybe you're trying to really directly comparing your study to another, or you're replicating someone else's work, then you can make an exception. So there's often exceptions. Just on that note, same with stats. Like I said, if you just run kind of a typical t-test or whatever, it's really just not a wise use of space to talk about in your abstract. But if it is especially important for some reason, whatever that might be, like maybe the size of the effect is really important to your study, or it's really, you're running a meta-analysis and that's kind of the whole thing, is to find a fairly exact effect size, maybe you would, but generally don't. Same goes for sample size. So again, remember, we're just trying to cover the most important parts in an abstract. So if you were in an elevator pitch, doing an elevator pitch to someone, and you wanted to highlight the most important things of your study, you're probably not going to say, well, we ran 59 subjects, right? It's just not, it's not the most important thing. And you will, and again, you will cover that and all these details in other sections. Abstract should be bolded, so just take note of that. Sorry, not the whole thing, but just the word abstract that appears at the top. It's kind of stupid. For a long time, abstract was not supposed to be bolded, and then the most recent manual, they said bold it. I don't know who makes up these rules, but you have to follow them, so just remember that. Okay, so again, previous research at a glance. Just really quickly, what is kind of the research that you're building on, and what was unknown that you tested? What were the methods, really quickly? What was found? But again, not the specific tests or means, unless you have really strong reason to do so. And what does this relate to, and what are the implications? So kind of a couple sentences on each of these things. Remember to use your space effectively and efficiently. Okay. So what I'm going to do is so that's kind of, other than, that's kind of all I want to tell you. I can really tell you about writing an abstract. We'll go over some common mistakes later, but I think a better way to learn this would be for you to look at some abstracts and, take note of some good things and take note of some bad things. So I'm going to show you a bunch of abstracts. Some of them I wrote to be deliberately bad. Some of them are really good ones. So you can kind of look at them and kind of observe good and bad things. And think about what we've talked about so far. Is this kind of a good way to point someone towards or away from your research? Is this a good use of space? If you do have limited space, to describe your research, is this a good way to use that space? Okay. So first one, human problem solving is one of the most fascinating and poorly understood aspects of cognition. It has been well documented that some strategies can lead to improvement in problem solving. We found that incubating a problem improves rates of solving it. These results were significant. Similar results were found in both easy and difficult rat trials. These results have implications for a variety of cognitive topics. So pause the video, think about this one. When you're ready, resume it, and I'll tell you the problems. But I really do want you to try to spot the problems yourself. That will help you remember. Okay, so first thing, let's just look at some of these sentences and why they're bad. Human problem solving is one of the most fascinating and poorly understood aspects of cognition. Well, whether it's fascinating or not is not really important, right? Remember, this is science. We're writing objectively. We don't care whether you find it interesting or not. I care. I sincerely hope you find this stuff interesting. But to a reader, we need to be a bit more professional, right? So stick with what do we know and what do we not know. Okay? This whole thing, human problem solving, is one of the most fascinating. Like, okay, thanks. Poorly understood aspects of cognition. Well, I mean, that's probably true. We don't probably understand problem solving super well. I mean, but the sentence itself is just not helpful. It's too broad, right? Poorly understood aspects of cognition. Like, how about narrowing it down a little bit, right? I mean, problem solving is a big, big field. We just talked about a few select issues, but what's not understood about it? The analogies, the tasks we use, incubation, could be any of those things, right? So when you start as broad as human problem solving, it's not the best way, right? Start a little more precisely with incubation. It has been well documented that some strategies can lead to improvement in problem solving. Again, what does that really tell us? I mean, are we even researching those strategies? What strategies are they even talking about? Like, just 2 sentences in, almost halfway in, or a third in or whatever, I still have no idea what this paper would be about, right? Again, if you think of this in terms of guiding the reader towards or away from your paper, depending on what they're researching, doesn't really help there. 2 sentences in, I still have no idea what the paper is about, okay? Again, what are these strategies? How do they relate? I don't know. Okay, we found that incubating a problem improves rates of solving it. Well, okay, how about a better use of space? How about explaining what incubation actually is? Right? That seems important. It is important. What kind of problem are we talking about here, right? What problem? Rat trials, some sort of puzzle? That's not mentioned either. So these results were significant. This kind of, hopefully, notice, not a good use of space, right? I mean, first of all, if you already said that we found that incubating a problem improves rates of solving it, I mean, you wouldn't say that unless it was significant, right? Because that's kind of the way we look at things, right? We don't say there was no significant difference, but then also say there was a difference, right? Because if it's not significant, then that just means it's to the chance, most likely, and we can't bank on it. So just saying here, incubating a problem helps solve it would be enough. This extra sentence with the numbers, not a good use of space, right? You can kind of hopefully see what a waste this is, right? So similar results were found in both easy and difficult rat trials. Well, I mean, that's not something we looked at, but if that is something that this person looked at, well, okay, what was the point of that, and what does that actually tell us? Again, not very clear. These results have implications for a variety of cognitive topics. Well, again, what is that really telling us? I mean, it's a cognitive psych paper. Of course, it has implications for a cognitive topic. Right? Be more specific. What is incubation, either theoretically or practically? What is kind of the use of that? How can we use incubation? Well, we can use it to help solve problems, and it suggests that kind of just taking a break might be helpful to people, right? So again, the last sentence is not really helpful. So you can kind of see all the wasted time here, wasted space. These first couple sentences, the stats, and the last one, those could be replaced with things that are much more useful, like what is incubation? What were these problems that we had people solve? What does this tell us? How do we put it into practice? What's a rat trial, right? But just keep in mind that stuff like that is really good, but too much information can be bad as well, right? Like, I think I have some examples later, but explaining what a rat trial is, that's a good use of time, right? Explaining that the exact amount of time we gave people, how long was the incubation period, how many trials were there, not so much, right? I mean, maybe if you have the space, but not necessarily. Something like counterbalancing, that's really not a great use of space. I mean, every study is going to be most likely counterbalanced. Again, if you were pitching this to someone in an elevator, you had a limited time, would you go into the exact details of, say, how many trials? Exactly how long incubation was, probably not. Okay, a few other things. So it should say the word abstract above here. I'll show you an example in a minute. Again, what is incubation? It's also indented. Remember, we're not supposed to do that. Not a fan of the stats. Also the wrong test, but actually no, if it's incubation versus not and also easy versus rat, that would be correct. But there it is. Again, what is incubation? What is a rat? And the last sentence is too vague. The first sentence is too broad. Okay. So for this next one, I'm just going to, it's about strip effect. So just as, I just want to remind you what that is. Just so this abstract will make some sense. So remember with strip effect, you're given words, you're given colors written in non-matching ink. So mostly non-matching, you have red written in red, green written in blue, orange written in purple, and you have control words. And your job is to say what the font color is. Okay, so red, blue, purple, red, green. The first set is a lot harder because the word itself, not the font color, interferes. Right? It makes it up. You want to process what the word says as opposed to what the font color is. Okay? Here's an abstract for that. Here we demonstrate that human cognition can be disrupted by tasks that are easy to perform. Subjects were given color words that were congruent or incongruent and tried to read them as fast as possible. Subjects found it difficult to perform incongruent trials as well. These results suggest that visual interference can be created by presenting easy to read stimuli that contrast with difficult to process stimuli. Implications for memory and attention are discussed. Okay, so pause the video, read that over, try to write down everything you see that's a problem, and then resume when you're ready. Okay, so a bunch of things here. Here we demonstrate that human cognition can be disrupted by tasks that are easy to perform. Well, that's a pretty vague statement, right? Human cognition, what does that mean? That could mean memory, problem solving, attention, could mean a million things, right? Be more specific, processing ability, processing speed, something like that, right? Tasks that are easy to perform. Again, that's okay, I guess, but still a little bit vague. Subjects were given color words that were congruent or incongruent and tried to read them as fast as possible. Well, what do you mean by, so again, try to kind of take the perspective of an outsider here. What does it mean by given color words? Is the font colored? Is the word a color? What does congruent or incongruent mean? Right? That's not really explained. Again, I'm not a fan of writing kind of too many specific details about methodology because you'll have your own section on that, but you definitely need to explain what you mean, what the basics are, right? So what do we mean by color words? Well, we mean this, right? Subjects found it difficult to perform incongruent trials. So what exactly does that mean as well? Difficult to perform, I mean, it's kind of suggesting that they just took longer, but it's pretty vague. Again, just be specific. It took them a longer time. That would be much better. Just while we're on the subject though, going back to the last one, examples are a really great thing to have, I think pretty much anywhere, but especially in an abstract, right? So rather than saying, trying to explain in words, congruent or incongruent, just show people what you mean. Just include an example, the word green written in blue next to congruent or incongruent, right? Examples can make it way easier to see what you mean. If it's not very intuitive, I'll show you an example of that in a bit. Okay. These results suggest that visual interference can be created by presenting easy to read stimuli contrast with difficult to process stimuli. I guess that's okay. It's nothing too bad. But it's kind of hard to still know what you mean by easy to read stimuli. This last sentence, implications for memory and attention are discussed. Well, again, what might those implications actually be? Again, it's a cognitive psych paper. Obviously, it relates to memory and attention. That's not really helpful. Also still missing the word abstract. Okay. So, what was I saying? That's kind of all the issues with this one, right? It's really unclear what's being tested here, what the implications are. Oh yeah, so just keep in mind that, and again, we'll look at examples of this where it is okay. Sometimes, your results or your study is too complicated to be able to neatly pack into an abstract, right? Sometimes you might have, like, say, a complicated model that, is not something you can adequately describe in one sentence. So in that situation, saying it has implications for something is not necessarily bad. Sometimes that is okay if it's just not plausible to kind of cover what that implication might actually be in the abstract, right? But again, you at least need to be somewhat specific. So implications for what? For recognition memory, for, driving in cell phones, for solving a problem. Memory and attention is just still too vague, right? Okay, let's look at a good one. This is actually mine, so. So this is what it should look like. Sorry, this is an old slide. Abstract should be bolded. So you can change that. Of course, you shouldn't have these little blue ticks. Just fix that, don't forget. Okay. Global matching models of memory suggest that familiarity is generated by the amount of overlap between features, such as letters in a word. Between features such as letters in a word in memory and features in a test item. However, previous research has not investigated the possibility that certain letters are weighted more heavily in the computation of a familiarity signal. Drawing from linguistic literature, we investigated if the first and last letter are weighted more heavily. We use the reverse RWI paradigm. So I do have a citation here just because it's particularly relevant, where participants studied word fragments and rate the familiarity of complete words. Of the studied fragments, we varied whether the first and last or middle letters were present. Test items whose fragments contained the first and last letters felt more familiar than the test words whose fragments contained inner letters. So what we're doing is we're having people study things like these fragments of, say, a word like raindrop, and then you get tested on the full word and you rate how familiar the word feels. We're manipulating what letters are being shown. So whether it's the first and last letters or some other letters. This suggests that the first and last contribute more to familiarity than do middle letters. Experiment 2, we also showed that letters next to other letters create stronger familiarity signals than do separated letters, despite the overall number of letters being the same. This suggests that the association between letters within a word is also used in the computation of familiarity. This is also not being considered in word recognition. So, okay. So this is kind of something to think about with an abstract, right? Sometimes if you're dealing with a lot of literature, you have a lot to pack in, it might be difficult. You might not be able to just explain everything. So kind of assuming people know what familiarity is, stuff like that. I don't really have the space or the time to go into the specific linguistic literature, but I do kind of say where I got this from. Notice the examples here, right? So when I didn't include one for the first and last experiment because I felt that was pretty straightforward. But when we say letters next to other letters, people would probably be wondering, well, what does that mean? So that's why I give an example. Examples are great, just like with Stroop, rather than trying to describe it in words. Well, sorry, you can describe it in words, but an example helps a lot. Notice it's a pretty small amount of space, but just these couple examples here help illustrate what I'm saying, right? So you'll kind of notice here how you can almost imagine how this is like a summary of a full paper. Here is what is the previous research we're building on? Well, just this idea that familiarity is created by a match between features in memory and features of a test item. However, previous research, so now I go, okay, so that's explained. Well, what are we investigating here? Previous research has not investigated the possibility that certain letters are more important than others. Briefly, where you don't necessarily need this, but why we would predict this. And then just, so that's kind of this first section, like an introduction. Here is kind of the methods very briefly. So how did we test this? What we varied, but again, not overloading details here. So just kind of example of what we did, but not too much information, right? Not stuff that's kind of not super important, like subjects, counterbalancing, trials, stuff like that. Let's save that for the methods generally. Okay, what we found, notice no stats here, just in English. Those ones where the fragments that were studied had the last letters felt more familiar. What does this tell us? Right? That's the sentence here. And this one's a little different because it's two experiments that are kind of different, but you can kind of see the overall structure. So this is kind of what I'm looking for, right? You can kind of imagine how if someone was looking to do research on word recognition, features and memory, language stuff, they could read this and they could get a sense of what's important here, or what is this paper going to be about, right? Okay. Let's look at another one. Okay. When people evaluate claims, they often rely on what comedian Stephen Colbert calls truthiness, or the subjective feeling of truth. Subjective feelings of truth. In 4 experiments, we examine the impact of non-probative information on truthiness. Experiments 1A and 1B, people saw familiar and unfamiliar celebrity names, and for each quickly responded true or false. 2 of the between subjects claim this famous person is alive or this famous person is dead. Within subjects, some of the names appeared with a photo of the celebrity engaged in his or her profession, whereas others appeared alone. Unfamiliar celebrity names, photos increased the likelihood that subjects would judge the claim to be true. Moreover, the same photos inflated the subjective truth of both the alive and dead claims, suggesting that photos did not produce an alive bias, but rather a truth bias. Experiment 2 showed that photos and verbal information similarly inflated truthiness, suggesting that the effect was not peculiar to photographs per se. Experiment 3 demonstrated that non-probative photos can also enhance the truthiness of general knowledge. General knowledge claims. Giraffes are the only mammals that cannot jump. These effects add to the growing literature on how non-probative information can inflate subjective feelings of truth. So this is actually a really cool experiment. What they're doing is they're showing, I don't know if I should spell this because I was considering it for the lab, but you show people a picture of something next to a claim, and they're more likely to think it's true. So if you show them the phrase or the statement, giraffes are the only mammals that cannot jump, and you show them a picture of a giraffe, they're more likely to believe it than if you just show them the statement. Pretty neat. Okay, but as an abstract, there are some issues here. So let's start at the top. Or sorry, take a minute to try and find some yourself, and then we'll go over them when you're ready. When you're ready to resume the video. When people evaluate claims, they often rely on what comedian Stephen Colbert calls truthiness or subjective feelings of truth. I'm not a fan of that statement. I mean, I like maybe as in an introduction, it's kind of an interesting quote or whatever. Kind of a fun term. I don't hate it that much. I just think for an abstract, it's not really a good use of space. Again, I mean, you could kind of start with, in four experiments, we examine the impact of non-probative information on truthiness. So you could pretty much start there, and would you even lose anything? I don't really think so. So that's where I think cutting this first sentence would be bad. Just a note here, this was kind of the first, first experiment on this. So if you did start with in four experiments, that would be okay that you're not really discussing prior literature, because there wasn't, for this paper, there wasn't really any prior literature that was relevant. So, I mean, that's another thing to consider. If you're dealing with something that is truly kind of novel and it's not really building on anything else, you don't necessarily have to try and force something in there. Okay, we examine the impact of non-probative information on truthiness. I think it would be a great, again, maybe in place of the first sentence, to explain what is meant by non-probative information. So what they actually do mean is that presenting a photo of something that doesn't really suggest the statement is true, it just is information, or it's just, it's information. So the example I gave, when you show people giraffes are the only mammals and you show them a picture of a giraffe, it's non-probative in the sense that it's not really suggesting in any way that giraffes can't jump. It's just a picture of a giraffe. That's kind of that's what they mean by non-probative. It's not really suggestive. It's just a photo. Okay. So in experiments 1A and 1B, participants saw familiar and unfamiliar celebrity names. For each, quickly responded true or false. I guess this part is fine. I mean, it's kind of lengthy, but it is important, I guess. And I don't know of a great way that you could condense all of this. But I really think kind of explaining what non-probative means would be a good use of space. I think, maybe you don't need to say saw familiar and unfamiliar celebrity names. Because that's not really the main point of the article. It's just whether that's kind of, somewhat secondary to just the effect of photos. So if you were to just kind of say photo celebrity, and then, they made the judgment, you could also just add, and this also happened for familiar and unfamiliar celebrity names, right? Maybe cut out some of this part. This part is fine, suggesting that photos do not produce an lie bias, but truth bias. That was kind of an important finding, so that's fine. Photos and verbal, yeah, that's fine. Experiment 2 part. I mean, I don't know. Do you really need this sentence suggesting that the effect is not peculiar to photographs per se? I could go either way on that. Experiment 3 demonstrated that non-probative photos can also enhance the truthiness of general knowledge claims. So, I mean, like I said, examples are really good. Like you're using something like Stroop, or say the rat task, or the fragments and recognition. I mean, I think in those situations, it's really good to give an example. But a general knowledge claim, I mean, I'm sure everyone could figure out what a general knowledge claim is, right? So that's where having an example here, especially given how long it is not the best use of space. Okay? And then the last sentence, that's perfectly fine. So yeah, this is kind of, a bit of a tough one because there's a lot to pack in there. I mean, in general, you won't really have to worry about this because, I mean, they're writing about 4 different experiments. You're only writing about one, and it only has one outcome, not multiple analyses. So, in general, it's more than likely going to be better for you to over-explain than under-explain because you're not in a big length constraint, or you don't have a big length issue. But it's just something to think about for when you do have, if you write a paper that has like 6 experiments, you have to kind of pack them all into an abstract. Then it becomes especially important to think about how to use your space well. Okay, next one. Long-held cultural association. A long-held cultural association exists between déjà vu, the bizarre feelings of having experienced something before despite knowing otherwise, and being able to predict the future. Recent research demonstrated illusory feelings of prediction during déjà vu. This present study investigated the hypothesis that a hindsight bias would be associated with déjà vu's prediction illusion. While engaged in a virtual tour, participants not only erroneously felt more able to predict the next turn during reported déjà vu, but following déjà vu also exhibited a bias towards erroneously and believing that they were correct in their predicted choice. These feelings of predictions and the accompanying hindsight bias were associated with higher scene familiarity levels. The results help to explain why people often associate déjà vu experience with so-called precognition. So take a minute and read this over. So this is another one of mine. Well, I'm actually second author on this paper. We published it in a good journal. So what we look at here is when people are in a déjà vu state, they feel like they have these feelings of premonition, but they're actually just an illusion. Kind of in line with that, people also show this kind of hindsight bias where after they made a prediction, even if they got it wrong, they still feel like they predicted it correctly, hence the hindsight bias. So this is kind of a nice outline of that. So what we're building on and how, and this is of course relevant because, you know, we're kind of explaining why people have this feeling. And so people have this feeling of prediction during déjà vu. Recent research demonstrated illusory feelings, or that these feelings are illusory. Present study investigated the hypothesis that a hindsight bias would be associated with déjà vu's prediction illusion. So again, because we're a little bit crunched for space here, you know, we don't have time to find hindsight bias. You know, you could probably get away here with not defining déjà vu, but I think it was fine. You know, you could kind of go either way. I don't remember what the word limit was on this, but either déjà vu or hindsight bias could be defined, I think, one or the other. You know, this is an example too where the whole methods of how we manipulated this was pretty tricky and not something you could neatly cover in an abstract. So just saying it's a virtual tour is fine. And then kind of what we found and what this tells us. Okay. All right. So another one, remember abstract should be bolded. So these slides are from before they changed that. Remember not to indent. Okay. Partial recollection, access to bits of information about an unretrieved target is assumed to be a major contributing factor to subjective metacognitive experiences. Actually, I'm going to skip this one. This is not. We've been over a couple of good ones, so that was another one of mine. Actually, yeah, we can go over this. So, yeah, partial recollection, access to bits of information about an unretrieved target is assumed to be a major contributing factor to subjective metacognitive states of memory, such as time experiences. Present findings call into question this assumption. Participants made more partial recollection attempts during TOTs than non-TOTs, but were incorrect more often than they were correct. When we computed the conditional probability of successful partial identification out of the total number of attempts, participants were no more likely to accurately identify partial information during TOTs than non-TOT. Moreover, participants exhibited a bias towards TOTs to infer access to details about the unretrieved target for which they did not have access or were wrong in their inference. Bias was not limited to TOT states, but also familiarity states. So just an example of, you can read the rest of that. We had like 6 experiments in this paper, so a lot to pack in, but kind of notice how space is used. Again, not a lot of no real unnecessary information like, exact means, t-scores, you know, exact methodology, how many trials, but what's kind of the most important stuff here? Well, people have assumed that when you have a TOT state, it's because you can say, remember just the first letter of the word. But we're suggesting that that's not actually true. It's just because people guess more when they're in a TOT state. So when we compared relative to number of attempts, people were not more accurate. Okay. Okay. So just the things to think about: when to explain versus not. Well, obviously, is there space for it? If so, explain. I will have a word limit on the abstract because, of course, I want you to think about how to use space effectively. But for the other assignments, this won't really be an issue. You can go more above the limit if you want, or above the required amount. But in general, you know, if there's space for it, then definitely explain it. Also, kind of, is it a known concept in research? If not, then explain it. And again, this can depend a lot on the nature of your study. So, you know, because it's so important, we felt the need to explain what déjà vu is here. It's something pretty, you know, that pretty much everyone knows. You could probably get away with not explaining it. So here we don't explain what a TOT is because presumably everyone would know what that is. But again, that's kind of dealing with the fact that we had like 6 experiments here. When you're, you know, in all your stuff, like I said, you're dealing with 1 experiment, there's probably no reason not to explain something unless it's like really, you know, not helpful. Like it's just not something that you need to know in an abstract. So again, we probably don't need to know, you know, what time of day did you take this study? How many participants were there? What were the exact means? Stuff like that, right? Was it counterbalance? Probably don't really need that stuff. But stuff like what is incubation? What was the task we used? That's definitely, I would say, important. So in general, like I said, it's safer to explain. The abstract is like the only assignment, probably the only assignment where you might lose a point if you talk about something that's really kind of like not a good use of space. Especially if if you say you explain something that is not important, but you didn't explain something that was important. Again, short examples are really helpful, like I said. And just like I kind of talked about before, if the implications are kind of complicated, or maybe too long, too much, you can say implications for whatever are discussed, but at least say what the implications relate to, right? So going back to the previous one, saying, what was it? Implications for a variety of cognitive topics, or implications for memory and attention, like that doesn't tell us anything, but implications for models of familiarity, implications for feelings of partial recollection, like if you can't say the whole thing, that's fine, but at least zero in on what the implications are about. Oh yeah, I have it here. So yeah, implications for subjective recognition memory, that's good, that's fine. If those implications are too much to talk about in the abstract. Okay, let's go over that one. Okay. When studying for any type of test, a person must predict how well they will remember each piece of information in question. The question of whether humans can predict their future memory has not previously been investigated. To investigate this question, we had participants study a list of words and judge whether they thought they would remember each word or not. Participants were later given a memory test. Implications for study habits are discussed. The results suggest that people can fairly accurately predict whether they will recall something in the future. These results are interesting because previous research has not investigated if intuition about memory predicts future performance. So what they're looking at here is kind of an aspect of metacognition where, does the stuff that you feel like you're going to remember, are you actually likely to remember it? Right? So if I say, Definitely I'll remember this example later. Is that true, or is it, just as likely to be remembered as something you don't think you're going to remember? That's a question here. So first sentence is, I'm fine with it. So that is kind of the implication here. What's really kind of the issue with this one is not so much that things are not explained well, it's just kind of the structure of it and the order of things. So this kind of seems more, so again, if you imagine an abstract is like a couple sentences but on each of the sections of the paper, this first sentence is more like an implication, something you would see in a discussion, more so than something you would see at the top of an introduction, right? I mean, most likely, not necessarily though. So I think this would be better if it was kind of later, kind of, an implication of that, like we talked about, do people's intuitions about how well they've learned something, are those accurate? But it definitely ties in with that, but I think it would make sense to talk about that kind of after you've introduced what the question is, right? So start with something a little bit, maybe different. The question of whether humans can predict their future memory has not been previously investigated. Again, you could probably start there. To investigate this question, we had participants study a list of words and judge whether they thought they would remember each word or not. That's fine. Later, give it a memory test. Implications. So again, look at the order here. It's just not logical. Implications for study habits are discussed. Well, that's not such a bad thing, because that is kind of the implication here. Again, if we're concerned with the people's estimates of what they've learned or haven't learned, match up with reality, then I would say that doesn't have implications for study habits. It's a little more, and it is kind of precise enough. But again, that feels like it should be last, right? Not before the results summary. The results suggest that people can fairly accurately predict whether they will recall something in the future. So that should be next. That should be right after kind of explaining the methods briefly. These results are interesting. Well, that's not a good sentence. Again, that's just too casual, too colloquial. So kind of X this last sentence here. You instead, talk about like the implications for studying, right? So that's the other thing. That's the other thing. Remember, and something to take away from this one. It should kind of flow in a logical manner. Don't put your results before your method or anything like that. Okay, how many do we have? So, all right, I'm just gonna take a break. Actually, no, I'll just keep going. So, again, these are all good ones, I think. But just kind of while we're on the topic, give you some examples of when it is tough to, pack everything into an abstract. So just take a minute to read this one. Oh, we should have the word abstract again. So just kind of because I brought it up, again, this is not something you have to worry about terribly, but this particular thing they're proposing, this model, it's kind of trying to merge these two fields of research, this idea that recognition is two processes, or it's just weaker and stronger processes, right? So I won't really go into that, but just notice kind of what I'm talking about here, where it's not really plausible to explain the full model in the abstract, but what they do is just kind of, talk about kind of what it accomplishes, right? So it's able to kind of agree with signal detection. That just means the strong versus weak approach versus also, distinguishing between two processes, right? So again, just kind of a lesson here is that sometimes you might not be able to pack everything in to an abstract, so like a full model or anything like that, but if you can at least cover kind of what it accomplishes, what it relates to, then sometimes that's the best. Okay. A couple more here. So, sorry, I should have abstract, but I just couldn't fit it. So, in the present study, it is shown that participants can recognize test cues as resembling study words, even when the cues cannot be used to recall the words they resemble. After studying a list of words, participants were given a cued recall test for which half of the cues resemble studied words on one particular feature dimension and half resemble unstudied words on that dimension. In addition to trying to use each cue to recall a study list item, participants rated the degree to which the cue resembled the study word. Those cues whose targets could not be identified, the mean rating was higher when the cues corresponded to studied items than when they corresponded to non-studied items. Various types of features give rise to this phenomenon, which was found when orthographic, phonemic, and semantic cue recall tests were used. In all of these cases, recognition without recall, analysis of receiver operating characteristics revealed a pattern consistent with that of an equal variance signal detection process. So this is obviously another tough one because you're packing 4 experiments in here, and there's a lot of, well, to some degree, there's a lot of prior research it builds on, but it's also fairly new, so that's why they kind of jump right into, what was done. I think the only thing with this one is that some examples might help, definitely. So, I mean, you could probably figure out what orthographic, phonemic, and semantic cued recall tasks are. It's pretty common, but with that said, I think like a couple words here and there, just giving examples might help. They do have kind of the 4 different. I actually really like the way this one's structured. So, because the 4 experiments are basically the same, they're just varying what type of cued recall task is. So in one, you're using orthographic features, one it's phonemic, one it's semantic, and then there was another variation. The fact that they kind of explain the finding and then say this happened across the 4, I think works pretty well here. So again, sometimes you need to make adaptations. Okay, so I think that's about it. You could read through these if you want to on your own. Just some more good. Actually, yeah, let's look at this one really quickly, or these couple. Oh no, this one. So again, abstract should be bolded. 2 experiments modeled after. This is a situation where I think citing the paper is better because it's basically copying it, replicating it. Remarkable levels, I think, is fine. This might be an example. Or so notice here how later they do give the exact numbers, but there's a good reason to, right? Because this is an experiment we'll do later. But what you find is that when you study words like bed, rest, and awake, people very often falsely report having seen the word sleep, right? Now, this is a situation where I think reporting the numbers is worthwhile because it's worth highlighting how big of an effect it is. So 40% of the time they'll think they saw sleep, right? So again, like I said, if it's particularly important or particularly noteworthy, then I don't have a problem with you including maybe the exact means. On the other hand, if it's not particularly important, then I wouldn't include it. And again, I think, exact means are at least preferable to tests, right? Because like, again, if you're pitching this to someone in an elevator, saying it was a really impressive effect, we got 40% free false recall, that's an interesting thing, right? But do they really care that much what your exact t-score was or your p-value? Probably not, right? Notice examples, really helpful. I'm not a fan of the 12 words. That is one thing I don't like about this one. And then other than that, it's fine. So what do these results tell us? Powerful illusion of memory. People remember events that never happened. This is kind of an early demonstration of false memory. Okay, then these other ones are all good, so you can, if you want, look at those on your own. So your assignment due a week from Thursday will be quick lab report, which watch the other lecture on that, and then also write an abstract about the problem solving experiment. So just kind of remember all this stuff we talked about. Make sure you have like formatted correctly, title page, running head, page number, all that stuff. And yeah, well, it's pretty straightforward. Remember to, because you're not dealing with a lot of stuff here, better to explain, should have lots of room. And let me know if you have any questions. I will upload that soon enough, probably tomorrow. Or no, you'll probably see this. Upload this probably tonight, but the assignment will probably be tomorrow. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Till next time. And then next week we'll start. What is next week? I think casting. Yeah, that's another fun one. Okay.